From my bedroom window, I watched my son strike the match. He smiled. It was a small, tight, nervous smile, but a smile nonetheless, as he touched the flame to the petrol-soaked foundations of my life. My daughter-in-law, Sophie, stood beside him, her hand on his arm, a little nudge of encouragement. "Sleep well," she'd cooed, locking my door from the outside just minutes before. A perfect, loving daughter. They thought they were sealing my tomb. They had no idea they were walking into their own. If you're listening to this, you've probably seen the headlines, but you don't know the truth, not the real truth. Let me tell you how a woman who built a £3 billion tech empire from a Cambridge garage discovered her own family considered her more valuable dead than alive. And oh, how spectacularly wrong they were about that. It all started 6 hours earlier, in the starched, sterile quiet of a private room in an NHS hospital. I was lying perfectly still, pretending to be lost in a medicated fog, while my son, Daniel, and his wife whispered their murder plot not 3 feet from my bed. Funny thing about being 72 and worth a fortune, everyone assumes your hearing is the first thing to go. Mine is perfect. So is my memory, despite the narrative they'd been carefully crafting for my doctors. I could hear the frantic hiss in Sophie's voice. "The pills aren't working fast enough," she whispered, the sound sharp enough to cut glass. Daniel shifted, the cheap fabric of his jacket rustling. He always looked uncomfortable in his own skin. "We can't just speed things up. There are cameras, nurses checking on her every hour." "Then we do it at home," she shot back, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Tonight, make it look like an accident." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but my breathing remained slow and even. The discipline of 1,000 board meetings. Never let them see you sweat. These 2 vultures had been feeding me increasing doses of digitalis for 4 months, a clever little plan hatched by Sophie, a former pharmaceutical sales rep. She knew exactly which drug could mimic the symptoms of dementia in the elderly, and she'd disguised it as heart medication. They thought I was confused, forgetful. What I actually was furious. You see, I built Beaumont Technologies from nothing in 1987. By 2010, we were a giant. I sold it for a life-changing sum, keeping enough to live more than comfortably forever. Daniel had always been lazy, a boy who believed his inheritance was the solution to a life he couldn't be bothered to build himself. Sophie was worse. She was ambitious, but with no talent to back it up, just a chilling pragmatism. "A fire would be perfect," she continued, and I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. "Old house, faulty wiring. She's been forgetting to turn off appliances lately." How thoughtful. In reality, I'd been documenting every single one of their poisoning attempts, but I appreciated the character assessment. Have you ever had a moment of such shocking clarity that the world seems to slow down? That was me, in that hospital bed. The betrayal was so absolute, so biblical, it was almost elegant. The drive home from the hospital was surreal. Daniel helped me into the house with such tender concern, his arm around my frail shoulders. You would never have guessed he was planning to watch me burn. Sophie brought me a cup of tea, more digitalis no doubt, and kissed my forehead like a devoted daughter. The scent of her perfume, something expensive I'd probably paid for, filled my nostrils. It smelled like deceit. "We're just popping out to dinner, Mum," she announced, her voice bright and brittle. "The Gilded Pheasant. We've booked for 7:30. The Gilded Pheasant. A 45-minute drive away. They were establishing their alibi. The perfect, caring son and daughter-in-law enjoying a meal while poor, confused old Mum accidentally burns her house down. The moment their car disappeared down the drive, I got to work. My body felt weak from the poison, my thoughts a little foggy around the edges, but my will was forged from 30 years in an industry that eats the weak for breakfast. First, I called my private security firm. My voice was steady, betraying none of the tremor in my hands. "This is Catherine Belmont. I need the fire brigade and police at my residence immediately. Code 7. Code 7, a designation we'd established years ago. It meant family threat, imminent danger. It meant all hell was about to break loose. Then I began to gather my evidence. My legacy wasn't just the money, it was the meticulous, almost obsessive attention to detail that had built my company. I didn't become a billionaire by trusting people's memories. The fake medication bottles Sophie had been using with their professionally forged labels. The financial documents I'd had my investigators pull, showing Daniel's gambling debts. £2 million, a figure that made my breath catch. I hadn't known it was that bad. And the pièce de résistance, a life insurance policy they'd taken out on me 6 months ago, with them as the sole beneficiaries. I laid it all out on the polished mahogany of my dining table, a neat, damning collection of their greed. 40 minutes later, I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Through the window, I watched them, 2 figures in the dark, moving with a grim purpose. I saw the glint of the red petrol cans, the liquid splashing against the walls of the home my husband and I had built. Upstairs, the smoke detectors Daniel had so carefully disabled began to blink red, one by one. I'd reconnected them all. A small act of defiance, a signal that the game had changed. They thought they were the predators circling their prey. They were about to learn that this old lioness wasn't just awake. She was waiting, and she was hungry. I sat down in my favorite armchair in the living room, the one with the view of the garden, and smoothed down my silk dressing gown. I arranged the evidence on the coffee table beside me, as if preparing for a board meeting. The faint, acrid smell of petrol began to seep through the floorboards. Any moment now, they would open that door, expecting to be met with a wall of flame and the smell of their success. Tell me, what would you do if you knew your own child was about to set you on fire? Would you scream? Would you run? Or would you sit very, very still and wait for the trap you'd laid to spring shut? The front door creaked open, and the smell of petrol, sharp and sickening, rushed in to greet them. It hit them first, before the sight of me did. Sophie pushed the door fully open, her face a mask of feigned concern, ready to perform her grief over my charred remains. Instead, she found me sitting calmly in my favorite armchair, very much alive, with Fire Marshal Chen and Detective Mills flanked beside me like a pair of grim-faced angels. Daniel's face was a masterpiece of conflicting emotions. A flash of pure terror, followed by a clumsy attempt at relief. "Mum," he exclaimed, his voice cracking, "thank God you're safe. We smelled smoke from the street." How thoughtful of you to notice, I thought, especially since you're the ones who lit the match. The silence that followed was delicious. It was the sound of a meticulously planned future imploding. Have you ever watched someone realize they've not only failed, but have walked directly into their own trap? Their entire world shifts on its axis, and you can see it in their eyes. It's a sight to behold. Sophie, of course, recovered first. Sociopaths always do. "Catherine, darling," she said, her voice shaking just enough to sound convincing. "We just got back from dinner. Look, we have the receipt." She fumbled in her handbag, her manicured hands trembling as she brandished a slip of paper as if it were a shield. Fire Marshal Chen, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from granite, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we found accelerant poured around the entire perimeter of this house," he said, his voice flat and professional. The pattern, he explained, indicated a clear intent to trap whoever was inside. Daniel's face had gone a grey, pasty color. "That's impossible," he stammered, looking from the fire marshal to me. "Who would do such a thing?" Detective Mills, a sharp woman with eyes that missed nothing, consulted her notepad. She mentioned that I had observed 2 individuals from my bedroom window at approximately 8:15, pouring liquid from red containers around the foundations. "But we were at the Gilded Pheasant," Sophie insisted, her voice rising in pitch. "The staff will remember us," I said, my tone pleasant, conversational. I asked her how precisely they had managed to drive 45 minutes to a restaurant, order and eat dinner, drive 45 minutes home, attempt to commit arson, and still have time to notice smoke from the street on their return. "You're either remarkably efficient criminals," I mused, "or you're terrible at maths." Daniel's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Mum, you're not making sense. Why would we hurt you?" Detective Mills answered for him, her voice cutting through his pathetic whining. She mentioned the £2 million in gambling debts, pulling out the financial records I'd given her.
She then added the £2 million life insurance policy they'd recently taken out. The color drained from Sophie's face. She stared at the documents as if they were venomous snakes. "How did you get those?" she whispered. I finished the sentence for her. "Darling, when you're worth £3 billion, you don't just assume your family loves you for your sparkling personality. I had investigators monitoring both of them for months." Her mask finally slipped. The carefully constructed facade of the loving daughter-in-law crumbled to dust, revealing the spitting rage beneath. "You paranoid old witch," she hissed. "You've been spying on your own family." "Lucky for me," I replied sweetly, "since my own family has been trying to murder me." Fire Marshal Chen held up an evidence bag containing one of the empty petrol containers. He informed them it was found in the bushes by the front gate, with fresh fingerprints on the handle. That's when Sophie, ever the strategist, tried a new tactic. She claimed this was all a misunderstanding, that I'd been having paranoid delusions, and they were simply trying to get me the medical care I was refusing. "Medical care like the digestus you've been slipping into my tea?" I asked. The room went dead silent. Sophie's eyes widened in shock, but narrowing with pure, unadulterated hatred. Detective Mills leaned forward, her pen poised. She asked if I was claiming I'd been poisoned. Systematically, I confirmed, for approximately 4 months. I told them about the hair samples, the blood work, and the video surveillance I had of Sophie adding her special ingredient to my food and drinks. Daniel finally found his voice, a reedy, desperate sound. He claimed the medication was for my heart condition. "What heart condition would that be, Daniel?" I asked him. "I've never had a heart problem in my life. But digestus poisoning mimics dementia symptoms beautifully, doesn't it, Sophie?" Her silence was the only answer I needed. Detective Mills stood up. "Mr. and Mrs. Matthews," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument, "I'm going to need you both to come with me for questioning." Daniel protested, calling me a senile old woman making up stories. That's when I smiled, my sweetest grandmotherly smile. "Oh, darling," I said, looking directly at my son, "there's nothing senile about £3 billion and a very detailed will that, as of this morning, no longer includes either of you." As the police led them away in handcuffs, Sophie turned and mouthed a threat at me, her eyes burning with a promise of retribution. Daniel, on the other hand, was crying, great gulping sobs of a boy who had gambled everything. I felt nothing. Is that cold? To feel nothing as your only child is arrested for trying to kill you? Tell me in the comments if you think I should have felt a shred of pity. I didn't. I felt clean.
The next morning brought the press to my front door like vultures to a fresh kill. Sky News vans were parked on the verge, reporters with microphones clutched like weapons, trampling my azaleas. Billionaire tech pioneer survives murder plot. Family greed turns deadly. Silicon Valley grandmother outsmarts killers. I sipped my coffee, watching the circus from my kitchen window. 30 years of carefully guarded privacy gone overnight. Frankly, I'd rather be a living headline than a dead footnote. My solicitor, James Harrison, arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, looking like he'd aged 5 years since our last call. "Catherine, this is a legal nightmare," he said, accepting the coffee I poured for him into my favorite mug, the one that says, "World's Most Dangerous Grandmother." "Good," I said, my voice firm. "I want Daniel and Sophie to know exactly what they've lost. I want them to see it on every television, on every front page." James sighed, the sound of a man who knew he was in for a fight. He informed me the police were charging them with attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy. Sophie was also facing additional charges. Apparently, the digitalis she'd used required a prescription she didn't have. "She stole it from her old pharmaceutical contacts," I explained, my own investigators having already traced the batch numbers. Very sloppy for someone who thought she was so clever. James shook his head, a troubled look in his eyes. He reminded me, gently, that they were my son and daughter-in-law. Was I certain I wanted to pursue this to the fullest of the law? I set down my coffee cup harder than I intended, the ceramic clattering against the saucer. "James," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "they tried to burn me alive. They've been slowly poisoning me for months. Exactly how much family loyalty should I show to people who see me as a walking bank account with a pulse?" I understood his professional caution, but this was personal. This was about survival. He tried to talk about the implications, about Daniel being my only child. "If he goes to prison," I cut in, "then maybe he should have considered that before trying to murder his mother for money." My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Mills. The lab had confirmed digitalis in all the food samples I'd provided. The video evidence was admissible. The case, she wrote, was solid. I showed the message to James. "I didn't survive the tech industry by being sentimental," I told him. "I survived by being smarter and more ruthless than the people trying to destroy me." It seemed a shame I had to apply those same principles to my own family. Just then there was a knock at the front door. Through the window I could see my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, holding what looked like a lasagna. Behind her stood 3 other neighbors, all bearing Tupperware and concerned expressions.
When I opened the door, Mrs. Rodriguez enveloped me in a hug that smelled of garlic and sympathy. "Catherine, dear," she said, "we heard about the terrible incident. We brought food." Within minutes, my kitchen was full of neighbors I'd barely spoken to in 15 years. They'd all seen the news, of course, but more importantly, they'd all had their own suspicions about Daniel and Sophie. It was fascinating, really. My neighbors had been watching my potential murder unfold in slow motion, recognizing the warning signs I'd been too close or perhaps too hopeful to see clearly. "That boy never visited unless he needed something," observed Mr. Patterson from 2 houses down, a retired headmaster with an eye for bad character. "And that wife of his," he shook his head disapprovingly, "always asking questions about your business." Mrs. Chen from across the road added that just last month, Sophie had cornered her at the local Tesco to ask if I'd mentioned updating my will. It was a chilling revelation. They weren't just waiting for me to die, they were actively monitoring the progress of their inheritance. Then young Sarah from next door, a university student, stepped forward, her expression hesitant. "Mrs. Beaumont," she said, her voice barely a whisper, I recorded some of their arguments. They were loud enough to hear through the walls. I don't know if it's useful, but should I give the recordings to the police?" 20 minutes later, Detective Mills arrived to collect what amounted to a neighborhood's worth of evidence against my son and daughter-in-law. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd been documenting their behavior. As the neighbors finally left, with promises to check on me daily, a strange feeling washed over me. Gratitude, not for surviving, I'd never doubted I would, but for discovering I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. Have you ever been so focused on a threat in front of you that you failed to see the allies all around you? My phone rang again. It was James, calling from his office. He had news. The bail hearing for Daniel and Sophie was scheduled for the next morning. The prosecutor was asking for £2 million each. "Perfect," I said. "They don't have £2 million. That's why they tried to kill me in the first place." James's voice held a note of warning, but I cut him off. "James," I instructed, my voice cold as ice, "I want you to attend that hearing. I want you to look my son in the eye and tell him that his mother, the woman he tried to murder, hopes he enjoys his time in jail to think about what family really means." There would be no mercy, not from me. They had mistaken my love for weakness, and now they were about to learn how strong I could be. The bail hearing was a masterclass in cosmic justice. I sat in the front row, a silent, immovable object in my best navy suit. Around my neck, I wore the pearl necklace my husband, David, had given me for our anniversary years ago. If my son was going to see his mother for possibly the last time outside of a prison visiting room, I wanted him to remember exactly what he'd thrown away. Daniel looked terrible. The fluorescent lighting of the courtroom bleached the color from his face, leaving it sallow and gaunt. He was dressed in an orange jumpsuit that hung off his diminished frame, his hands shaking slightly. The jail doctor, I was later told, had diagnosed it as withdrawal. Apparently, his gambling addiction had acquired a cocaine habit as a co-conspirator. Sophie sat beside him, her usual polished appearance replaced by the harsh reality of remand center beauty standards. Her expensive highlights were dull, her skin blotchy. She was attempting to project an image of a wronged woman, but the cold fury in her eyes betrayed her. She was a predator in a cage, and she was furious at being caught. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Patricia Valdez, laid out the case with surgical precision. She spoke of the systematic poisoning, the calculated cruelty of making me believe I was losing my mind. She detailed the arson, the accelerant, the disabled smoke detectors, the cold-blooded attempt to burn me alive to collect on an insurance policy. As she spoke, a hush fell over the courtroom. Daniel's public defender, a tired-looking man who clearly knew he was on the losing side, attempted a weak defense. He spoke of family misunderstandings and stress-related poor judgment. It was pathetic. Sophie solicitor, an expensive private hire with a smug face, tried to paint her as a devoted daughter-in-law, driven to desperation by my alleged mental deterioration. That's when the judge, a formidable woman named Patricia Williams, turned her gaze on me. She asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Mrs. Beaumont," she said, her voice echoing in the silent room, "you are present in court today. Would you like to make a statement regarding bail for the defendants?" I stood up slowly, using the cane I didn't actually need for maximum dramatic effect. Every eye in the room was on me. "Your Honor," I began, my voice clear and steady. "I spent 40 years building a technology company from nothing. I employed 3,000 people, paid millions in taxes, and donated over £50 million to various charities." I paused, letting the weight of that sink in. I did this as a single mother, after my husband died when Daniel was 12. The courtroom was utterly silent, save for the frantic scratching of the court reporter's pen. I loved my son unconditionally. I told the court how I'd paid for his education, his wedding, his house, his cars. When he developed a gambling problem, I paid those debts too, hoping he'd learn from his mistakes.
I turned to look directly at Daniel, who couldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at his cuffed hands, a broken man. I described how I'd welcomed Sophie like the daughter I'd never had, trusting her with my health, my home, my life. My voice hardened. They repaid that love by trying to murder me for money they were too lazy to earn. "Your Honor," I concluded, my gaze sweeping from the judge to the two people in the dock. These people saw a 72-year-old woman and thought she'd be easy prey. I sat down, the silence in the room absolute. Judge Williams reviewed her notes for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she looked up. "Bail is set at £5 million each," she announced. A gasp went through the courtroom. 5 million! Even if they'd managed to steal my money, they couldn't have afforded that. As the court security officers led them away, Sophie turned and mouthed something at me. It looked distinctly like a threat. Outside the courthouse, the reporters swarmed like angry bees. One of them shoved a microphone in my face. "Mrs. Beaumont, how do you feel seeing your son arrested?" I looked directly into the camera. "Relieved," I answered honestly. For months, I thought I was losing my mind. Turns out I was just being murdered. There's actually something comforting about knowing the difference. Another reporter shouted, "Will you visit them in jail?" I paused, considering the question seriously. I spent 72 years being the kind of woman who forgave everything. It nearly got me killed. I think it's time to try being the kind of woman who remembers everything and forgives nothing. That quote made every evening newscast in the country. What do you think? Was I too harsh? Or was it exactly what needed to be said? 2 weeks later, I was standing in the empty shell of what had been Daniel's house, watching a moving company load the few possessions the bank hadn't seized into a lorry. The bank had foreclosed when his gambling debts came to light. While clearing out a bedroom safe, the foreman handed me a manila envelope. Inside, I found a handwritten letter in Daniel's scrawl. "Sophie, I can't do this anymore. She's my mother. Find another way." It was dated 2 days before their arrest. A flicker of conscience, 4 months too late. Just then, my phone rang. It was Detective Mills. "Mrs. Beaumont," she said, her voice grim, "we've had a development. Sophie's agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence." "Cooperate how?" I asked. "She's claiming Daniel was the mastermind," the detective replied. "Says she was coerced, afraid for her own safety. And there's more. She's claiming you've been mentally abusive for years, that Daniel felt trapped by your financial control." The audacity was breathtaking. Sophie wasn't just fighting for her freedom, she was trying to rewrite history, with me as the villain. The battle for my life was over. The war for the truth had just begun.
Financial control. The words hung in the air, so absurd, so utterly disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. According to Sophie's new narrative, I was a manipulative matriarch who held money over their heads, threatening to cut them off, making them feel worthless. I stood in the wreckage of my son's life, a life I had single-handedly funded, and felt a cold, clean rage rise within me. I met with the prosecutor, Patricia Valdez. Her office felt like a war room, and I had come prepared for battle. I'd had James retrieve 30 years of documentation from my private files, every bank statement, every receipt, every recorded phone call related to my son. I'd brought everything. If Sophie wanted to play the victim, I would show the jury exactly what kind of victim tries to burn her benefactor alive. Patricia spread my evidence across a vast conference table. It was a stunning, damning portrait of my generosity and their greed. Bank transfers for university fees, for a wedding, for 3 separate cars. Records of me clearing his credit card debt 5 separate times. And the big one, the £2.1 million to pay off his gambling debts. Total requests for repayment, 0. "This is remarkable, Catherine," Patricia said, her eyes wide as she reviewed a particularly damning transfer. "You've documented every financial interaction with your son for 30 years. I told her that in my business, you learn that people's memories become very selective when money is involved. I preferred facts to feelings." We listened to several of the phone calls I'd recorded after his first major gambling incident. In one from just 6 months ago, Daniel was practically weeping, begging for £400,000 to pay off some very unpleasant people. He'd sworn it was the last time, that he'd learned his lesson. He'd said the exact same thing the time before that. In the end, my voice on the recording, tired and resigned, instructed James to transfer the money. Then Patricia played Sophie's recorded statement from the day before. Her voice, thick with false emotion, described how I used money to control every aspect of their lives, how they felt like prisoners in their own home. A prisoner who drove a BMW I'd bought him, living in a house I'd paid for. The irony was staggering. That night, back in the secure penthouse suite I was now calling home, I received a text from an unknown number. "You can't hide behind lawyers forever, old woman." I knew instantly it was Sophie. Her solicitor had somehow managed to get her out on bond. I wasn't surprised. I'd expected it. I called my security company and forwarded them the number. The call came at 3 in the morning. My security chief, a calm ex-military man named Robert, informed me that someone was attempting to break into my old house, the one she'd tried to burn down. It was Sophie. She'd been watching the place and had come back to retrieve something she'd hidden. When the police arrested her, screaming about harassment, she saw me pull up. Her expression shifted from panic to pure, venomous hatred. "This isn't over," she snarled, her voice raw. "You think you're so smart, but I know things about you that would destroy your precious reputation." "Really?" I asked, my voice deceptively calm. "Do tell." That's when she played her final, most desperate card. "Your precious husband's death," she spat, her words echoing in the cold night air. The accusation hung there, thick and poisonous. Several of the police officers turned to stare at me. My husband, David, had died of pancreatic cancer. There were 4 doctors present, a hospital full of witnesses. "How convenient," she continued, her voice rising hysterically, "that he died right after signing his will, leaving everything to you instead of Daniel." Her solicitor, who had arrived looking disheveled and furious, grabbed her arm. But Sophie was beyond reason now. She poisoned him, just like I poisoned her. The only difference is she got away with it. The solicitor's face went white, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in 30 years, genuine fear. Not because it was true, but because she had just demonstrated how easily a lie could poison the past, especially when the only person who could refute it was dead. Have you ever had a lie told about you that was so monstrous, so impossible to disprove, that it threatened to swallow your entire reality? Detective Mills assured me it was a desperate attempt to create reasonable doubt, but I could see the seed of uncertainty in the eyes of the younger officers. As they led Sophie away, she managed to shout one last thing. "Check her medicine cabinet. Check what she keeps in her bedroom. She's not the innocent victim she pretends to be." Back in my car, the darkness felt suffocating. Sophie had crossed a line from attempted murder to the character assassination of a dead man. But she'd also revealed something crucial. She'd been in my house long enough to go through my personal belongings. I called James immediately. "Meet me at the house, now." 40 minutes later, James and I stood with 2 police officers in my bedroom, trying to figure out what Sophie might have been looking for. The medicine cabinet was unremarkable, but in my bedroom safe, behind my jewelry, we found it. An envelope marked, "For Catherine, in case anything happens to me. David." My blood ran cold. Inside was a handwritten letter from my husband, dated 1 week before his death. His familiar script, now shaky and frail, reached out to me from the grave. "Kate," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone. But there are things you need to know about Daniel and Sophie. They've been asking questions about my will, about your finances." Sophie specifically asked about medication interactions, whether certain drugs could accelerate illness. I didn't tell you because I hoped I was wrong. Please be careful. Our son may not be the man we thought we raised. I sat on my bed, staring at my husband's final warning, and realized with a sickening certainty that this hadn't started 4 months ago. It had been in motion for years. They hadn't just been waiting for him to die, they'd been researching how to help him along. The trial began on a grey Monday morning in October, under the watchful eye of a media circus that would have made P.T. Barnum proud. I sat in the front row, clad in my best black suit, the one I wore to hostile takeover meetings, my armor. If a jury was going to decide my son's fate, I wanted them to see exactly who they were dealing with, a woman who did not break. Daniel had lost more weight in jail. He looked smaller, diminished, a ghost haunting the man he used to be. Sophie, seated at a separate defense table, had gone the opposite route. She was playing the part of the young, vulnerable wife, dressed in a conservative blue dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. It was a carefully crafted performance, and I had a front row seat.
The prosecutor's opening statement was a masterpiece of controlled fury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Patricia Valdez began, her voice ringing with conviction. "This case is about greed so profound that it transformed a son into a would-be killer and a daughter-in-law into a calculating poisoner. The defendants didn't just want Catherine Beaumont's money, they wanted her life." Daniel's solicitor tried the broken family approach, painting a picture of a troubled man who had simply lost his way. He argued that wanting your mother's inheritance wasn't the same as wanting her dead. It was a weak, pathetic defense for a weak, pathetic man. Then Sophie's solicitor, a man with the predatory smile of a shark, went for the jugular. He claimed his client was manipulated, not by my son, but by an older, more sophisticated criminal, me. "The evidence will show," he declared, pointing a dramatic finger in my direction, "that Mrs. Beaumont has a history of using money to control people, and when that control was threatened, she orchestrated this entire scenario to eliminate the threats to her fortune." It was an interesting strategy. Sophie was now no longer just Daniel's accomplice. She was now positioning herself as my victim. The first week of testimony established the basic facts: the poisoning, the financial motives, the fire. But during the cross-examination, Sophie's solicitor began his real work. He called me to the witness stand. "Mrs. Beaumont," he began, approaching me with that oily smile, "you recorded conversations with your son without his knowledge, correct?" I confirmed that I had documented our financial discussions for legal protection. "You spied on your own family," he countered, his voice dripping with accusation. "I protected myself," I replied, my voice even, "from people who were stealing from me." He pounced on that. "Stealing, Mrs. Beaumont, or taking what they believed they were entitled to inherit?" The prosecutor objected, but the damage was done. He was skillfully twisting my prudence into paranoia, my self-preservation into malice. He then asked me how many times in 30 years my son had asked me to stop giving him money. I paused, understanding the trap. Daniel had never asked me to stop. He had never once said, "Mum, I don't want your help, I want to be independent." He accepted my money willingly, and the solicitor used that to paint a picture of a transaction. "And in exchange," you pressed. "Nothing," I said. His eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Nothing? You expected no gratitude, no say in how the money was spent?" Each question was a scalpel, expertly wielded to dissect my motives and present them as something sinister. He was making my generosity sound like manipulation, my love sound like a leash. He brought up Daniel's gambling problem. Had I sought professional help for him? I had suggested it, yes, but I had continued to give him money to pay his debts. "Didn't that enable his addiction, Mrs. Beaumont?" he asked, his voice soft and reasonable. "Were you trying to protect him, or were you trying to control him?" That night, back in my hotel suite, I replayed the cross-examination in my head. Sophie's solicitor had done something brilliant and terrifying. He had taken 30 years of a mother's love and twisted it into the portrait of a monster. How easy would it be for a jury to believe that a woman with £3 billion came with strings attached? Have you ever had your best intentions used as a weapon against you? It's a uniquely painful experience. James knocked on my door at 10 o'clock. He looked grim. "Catherine, we need to talk about tomorrow's testimony," he said. "They're going to try to make you sound like a monster, aren't they?" I replied, my voice flat. "They're going to try," a small grim smile playing on his lips. "But we have something they don't expect." He handed me a manila folder. It was from my investigators, the ones who had been following Daniel and Sophie. Inside were transcripts of conversations I'd never heard. I read the first one, my blood turning to ice. It was a recording of them in their car after visiting me in the hospital. Sophie's voice was cold and clinical. "She's weaker than I thought. A few more doses and she won't even be able to sign her own name." Daniel's voice was hesitant. "What if someone notices the symptoms?" "Who's going to notice?" Sophie had replied, her voice laced with contempt. "You're her only family, and you're helping me dose her. It's the perfect plan." I could hear the sickness in Daniel's voice as he replied, "I feel sick about this." "You'll feel sicker if those people from Atlantic City kill you for the money you owe," Sophie had snapped back. "This is survival, not murder." And then my son, my only child, had said the words that would haunt me forever. "It's exactly murder." Sophie's reply was the coldest thing I had ever read. "No," she said. "It's evolution. She's old, she's alone, and she's in our way. This is just nature taking its course, with a little help." I stared at the transcripts, my hands shaking. This was more than just a plan to get money. This was a philosophical justification for killing me. James pointed to another page. It was about to get worse. I held the transcripts in my hands, the paper cool against my skin, but the words burned. "It's evolution. She's old, she's alone, and she's in our way." This wasn't just a crime of passion or desperation. This was an extermination, planned with the cold, detached logic of a corporate takeover. That night, I didn't sleep. I simply sat and let the hatred purify me, burning away the last vestiges of the mother I used to be. The next morning in court, I gave the folder to Patricia Valdez. "Play them," I said, my voice a quiet command. "All of them. I want that jury to hear exactly what my loving family thought of me." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through her eyes before she nodded, her expression hardening into a mask of grim determination. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Sophie's solicitor was swaggering, confident he had successfully painted me as a manipulative crone. He had no idea what was coming. Patricia stood and informed the judge that the prosecution would like to present new evidence, audio recordings. A technician set up the speakers, the silence in the room growing heavy, thick with unspoken questions. Then the sound filled the room. It was Sophie's voice first, crisp and clinical, talking about dosages, about how my confusion would make their story more believable. It was chilling. But then came Daniel's voice. "Have you ever heard a sound that completely redefines your past?" Hearing my son, the boy I had raised, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, calmly discussing my murder was like listening to the soundtrack of my own heart breaking. The jury was transfixed, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief. I watched them, not Daniel or Sophie. I saw a woman in the back row put a hand to her mouth. A man on the end stared at the speakers as if they were spitting venom. Then came the final, damning exchange. Daniel's flicker of conscience, it's exactly murder, extinguished by Sophie's cold, reptilian logic. No, it's evolution. A guttural retching sound broke the silence. Daniel had leaned over and vomited into a waste bin beside the dock. His entire body convulsed with the poison of his own words, now made real. Sophie, however, sat bolt upright, her face pale but her expression unreadable. She was calculating, even now, searching for an escape hatch that no longer existed. The prosecutor let the silence hang in the air for a full minute before calling her final witness, Dr. Alicia Sharma, the toxicologist who had analyzed my blood samples. Dr. Sharma, a woman with a calm, authoritative presence, explained the science behind the cruelty. She told the court that the level of digitalis in my system was enough to have caused a fatal cardiac episode within weeks. She described the poisoning as extremely sophisticated. The doses, she explained, were carefully calibrated to create maximum cognitive decline without immediate detection. A layperson could never have managed it.
It required, in her professional opinion, someone with pharmaceutical knowledge. All eyes in the courtroom drifted to Sophie. Her solicitor's cross-examination was aggressive but futile. Dr. Sharma was unflappable. He made one last desperate gambit, suggesting the possibility that I had poisoned myself to frame my son. The question hung in the air, obscene and absurd. Dr. Sharma looked at him with an expression of pure professional disdain. She asked if he was seriously suggesting a 72-year-old woman would poison herself for 4 months, stage an elaborate arson, and risk death, all to frame her own child? The jury looked at me, then back at him. The question had answered itself. Then, against her solicitor's frantic advice, Sophie took the stand. She was an actress giving the performance of her life, her voice trembling, tears welling in her eyes. She spoke of her love for me, a love twisted and broken by my controlling nature. She described a life of walking on eggshells, of every gift coming with strings attached. It was a compelling story, if you hadn't just heard her calmly plotting my death. She claimed I had been medicating myself, that my paranoia had spiraled out of control. She denied everything about the fire, painting herself and Daniel as innocent bystanders who arrived home to a terrifying scene. It was a breathtaking display of pathological denial. What do you do when someone's reality is built on a foundation of such audacious lies? Patricia Valdez began her cross-examination, her questions like a surgeon's scalpel. She asked Sophie, a former pharmaceutical sales rep, if she was familiar with Digalis. Sophie denied it, a lie so blatant the air in the room seemed to thin. Patricia pressed, asking if, in her entire career, she had never learned how the drug affects elderly patients. Sophie's silence stretched for an eternity before she mumbled that she might have some basic knowledge. The final questions were the kill shots. Patricia asked why, if she was so concerned about my paranoia and forgetfulness, she had never once mentioned the possibility of drug toxicity to any of my doctors. "It never occurred to me," Sophie whispered, her composure finally cracking. "It never occurred to you? A woman with your background seeing all the classic symptoms of Digalis poisoning, and it never once crossed your mind?" The jury saw through it. They saw through her. Her medical knowledge had become the noose around her own neck. As the court recessed for the day, I watched my son being led back to his cell. He looked hollowed out, a man who had finally understood the full, annihilating consequences of his choices. Sophie, however, caught my eye as she passed. Her expression held no remorse, no fear, just cold, hard calculation, and the silent, chilling promise that this wasn't over. The jury deliberated for 18 hours. I spent that time in my hotel suite, a prisoner of a different kind, staring out at the London skyline. I watched the city lights blur and sharpen through the window, each one a life, a family, a story that wasn't mine.
My life had been reduced to this, waiting for 12 strangers to decide the final chapter of my family's story. James brought me updates every hour, his face etched with the strain of the wait. They had asked for the recordings to be replayed. They wanted to review the financial documents, the insurance policies. Each request was a small torture, a fresh twist of the knife. At 3 o'clock on the second day, the call came. A verdict had been reached. Walking back into that courtroom felt like walking into my own past, present, and future all at once. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and anticipation. I took my seat in the front row, wearing the same black suit, my armor, and waited. The foreman, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, stood to read the verdict. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the dead silence. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree against Catherine Beaumont, he began, his voice steady. How do you find the defendant, Daniel Matthews? He paused. Guilty. Daniel's shoulders slumped, a puppet with its strings cut. His solicitor put a hand on his arm, but Daniel was staring at me, his expression unreadable, a hollowed-out cavern of a man. The foreman continued, his voice a relentless drumbeat of justice. Conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. Arson in the first degree, guilty. Then came Sophie's verdicts. Guilty on all counts, plus the additional charges for the poisoning and fraud. The jury had seen through her performance, her tears, her lies. They had seen the monster beneath the mask. The prosecutor's office had already indicated they would seek life without parole for both of them. As the court officers approached to escort him back to custody, Daniel turned to me one final time. His voice, when it came, was not a shout but a raw, broken cry that cut across the courtroom. "Mum," he called out, "I'm sorry." For the first time in months, I looked at my son and saw the boy I'd raised, not the man who had tried to kill me. But sorry wasn't a time machine. It couldn't unpoison the tea, unstrike the match. "I know you are," I called back, my voice clear enough for him to hear. "But sorry doesn't bring back the mother you threw away when you decided money was worth more than my life. Tell me, is sorry ever enough to undo something like that?" That evening, alone in my hotel room, I did something I hadn't done since the night of the fire. I cried. Not for Daniel or Sophie. They had made their choices. I cried for the family I thought I had, for the love I had believed was real. I cried for the 30 years I had spent loving people who saw me as nothing more than a bank account with a pulse. My phone rang. It was Detective Mills. "Mrs. Beaumont," she said, her voice gentle. "I wanted to call personally to tell you that justice was served today." "Was it?" I asked. "My son will spend his life in prison. I'm alive, but I'm alone." "Catherine," she said, her tone shifting, "you survived. You fought back. You proved that wisdom can beat greed. That's a victory by any definition." 6 months later, I was sitting on the terrace of my new house in Salcombe, watching the sunset paint the Devon coastline in shades of gold and rose. The house was smaller than my old one, but the peace it held was infinite. No hidden cameras, no poison in my food. Just me, the sea breeze, and a future I was finally free to write for myself. My neighbour, Eleanor, a sharp-witted widow of 75, brought me a glass of wine and settled into the chair beside me. She had become the closest thing to family I had left. "Any regrets?" she asked, a question that had become a gentle ritual between us. I considered it seriously. About surviving? Not for a second. About the family I lost every single day. But then I remember that the family I thought I lost never actually existed. It was a fiction I had told myself for 30 years. The money was never the point. Daniel could have had every penny if he'd simply waited for me to die naturally and treated me with a shred of human decency in the meantime. Instead, he chose greed over love, and in doing so, he lost everything. I think he understands that now, in the silence of his cell. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, I raised my glass in a private toast. A toast to the woman I had been forced to become, a survivor, a fighter, and proof that sometimes the best revenge against people who want you dead is simply refusing to die. Have you ever had to start over, not from scratch, but from the ashes of what you thought your life was? It's a strange and quiet liberation. Daniel and Sophie had wanted to inherit my fortune by eliminating me from the equation. Instead, they had eliminated themselves, leaving me with something far more valuable than money. They left me the knowledge that I was strong enough, smart enough, and stubborn enough to outmaneuver anyone who mistook my love for weakness. They left me with my life, and that is an inheritance beyond price.